Blood and whiskey stained the sawdust floor of Murphy's saloon as Ezra Kane stood over Jake Sutter's writhing form, his split knuckles dripping crimson onto the fallen man's chest. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung thick in the smoky air, mixing with the stench of fear and hatred that permeated the room. "You yellow bastard." Sutter spat blood scrambling backward like a wounded crab. "You let Tommy Morrison die out there, ran like a dog with its tail between its legs." The saloon fell silent except for Sutter's labored breathing. 20 pairs of eyes fixed on Ezra with the cold judgment of a jury pronouncing sentence. These men had once called him friend, had trusted him to watch their backs on cattle drives and in skirmishes with raiders. Now they looked at him like something poisonous that had slithered out from under a rock. But instead of the expected shame, something dangerous flickered in Ezra's dark eyes. He reached down, grabbed Sutter by the shirt, and hauled him to his feet with surprising strength. "You want to call me a coward?" Ezra's voice was low, deadly calm. "Then have the balls to say it to my face like a man, not from your back like a whipped cur." The unexpected defiance sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. This wasn't the broken, guilt-ridden Ezra they'd been tormenting for weeks. This was something else, entirely something that made even the boldest men take a step back. Sutter's bravado crumbled under Ezra's unwavering stare. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." Ezra's grip tightened on the man's shirt. "You meant every word. But here's the thing, Jake, you weren't there. You didn't see what happened in Devil's Canyon. You didn't hear Tommy's last words." The room held its breath. Even Buck Morrison, leaning against the bar with his arms crossed, seemed suddenly interested in what Ezra might reveal. "What words?" Doc Harrigan asked quietly from the corner, his weathered face creased with concern. Ezra's eyes never left Sutter's face. "He said, 'Tell my brother I'm sorry.' Not sorry for dying, not sorry for the fight, sorry for the secrets he'd been keeping. Secrets that got him killed. Now that's a lie." Buck Morrison's voice cracked like a whip across the room. "My brother didn't have any secrets." For the first time, Ezra turned to face Tommy's older brother directly. "Didn't he? Then why was he so eager to volunteer for that patrol? Why did he insist on riding point when he knew the Apache had been active in that area?" Buck's face had gone pale beneath his tan. "He was doing his duty. He was running from something," Ezra said flatly. "And whatever it was, it killed him just as surely as that Apache arrow." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ezra released Sutter, who stumbled backward into the crowd, and turned his attention to the rest of the room. "You all want someone to blame for Tommy's death." He continued, his voice carrying a bitter edge. "Well, here I am. Blame me if it makes you sleep better at night. But don't pretend you knew the man who died out there, because I'm the only one who heard his last confession." Without another word, Ezra pushed through the crowd and out the batwing doors into the brutal Nebraska sun, leaving behind a room full of men, suddenly uncertain about everything they thought they knew. 3 weeks later, Ezra Kane sat on the sagging porch of his weather-beaten cabin, nursing a bottle of rot-gut whiskey and watching vultures circle overhead. The isolation was gnawing at him like a cancer, but it was preferable to facing the mixture of fear and hatred he'd stirred up in town with his cryptic words about Tommy Morrison's secrets. At 28, Ezra had envisioned a different life for himself by now. A thriving ranch, maybe a wife and children respect in the community. Instead, he was a pariah, living on the scraps of his former existence, sustained by guilt and cheap alcohol. His once proud spread had deteriorated into a monument to failure-broken fences, a well-running dry, and cattle scattered to the four winds. The distant rumble of wagon wheels cut through his brooding. Ezra squinted through the heat shimmer and recognized Doc Harrigan's familiar buckboard approaching, followed by a second wagon driven by a thin, nervous-looking man in a worn black suit. "Kane," Doc called out as he pulled up his usually gentle voice, carrying an edge of urgency. "We need to talk." Ezra didn't move from his chair, the whiskey bottle dangling from his fingers. If you're here to deliver more of the town's judgment, save your breath. This isn't about judgment, the stranger said, climbing down from his wagon with the careful movements of a man accustomed to disappointment. Name's Harold Crane. I've got a proposition that might benefit us both. A soft sound came from the back of Crane's wagon, not quite a sob, but close. Ezra's curiosity got the better of him, and he stood swaying slightly from the whiskey. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A young woman sat propped against some blankets, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face pale but defiant. Her legs were covered by a rough wool blanket, but even from a distance, Ezra could see they lay unnaturally still. When her eyes met his, he saw intelligence there and pride and a deep, abiding anger that he recognized all too well. "This is my niece, Isabel." Crane said, his voice carrying a note of distaste that made Ezra's jaw clench. 6 months ago, she had herself an accident. Wagon overturned on her way back from visiting friends in Omaha. Family's been caring for her since, but he gestured vaguely at his worn clothes and tired horse. We can't afford to keep her anymore. "What's that got to do with me?" Ezra asked, though he already suspected he wouldn't like the answer. Doc Harrigan cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Buck Morrison's been talking to folks in town. He's made it clear that if you were to take on the responsibility of caring for Miss Crane here, he might be willing to let bygones be bygones." Ezra felt his stomach turn. So this was Buck's idea of just to saddle the supposed coward with a crippled woman, make them both suffer together in exile. It was cruel and calculating, exactly what he'd come to expect from Tommy's brother. "And if I refuse?" Crane's smile was thin and ugly. "Then Isabel becomes the territory's problem. There's a workhouse in Omaha that takes in unfortunates. As for you," he shrugged, "you can keep drinking yourself to death out here for all I care." Isabel spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Don't I get a say in any of this? You had your chance to make your own way." Crane snapped. "This is what's left." The young woman's hands clenched into fists on her lap, and Ezra saw the tremor of rage she was trying to suppress. He recognized that feeling, the helpless fury of someone who'd been discarded by the world, whose opinions and desires no longer mattered to anyone. "What exactly are you proposing?" Ezra asked. Doc Harrigan looked deeply uncomfortable. "Marriage, Kane. Legal and binding. Buck's offering to provide a modest dowry enough to get you both back on your feet in exchange for your protection of Miss Crane." The word protection hung in the air like a bad smell. Ezra looked at Isabel again, seeing the way her knuckles had gone white with the effort of maintaining her composure. The dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant pain. "And what does the lady think of this arrangement?" Ezra asked. Isabel's chin lifted defiantly. "I think it's the best of several terrible options. At least with you, I know I'm dealing with someone who understands what it means to be thrown away." The brutal honesty of her words hit him harder than any of the insults he'd endured in town. Here was someone who saw through the pretense and manipulation to the raw truth underneath two broken people being forced together by circumstances beyond their control. "There's one more thing," Crane said, reaching into his coat pocket. "Buck Morrison wanted you to have this. Consider it a wedding gift." He held out a thick envelope, and Ezra could see the corners of greenbacks peeking out. Blood money, he thought. Payment for taking on the burden no one else wanted. 30 pieces of silver. Isabel said quietly, and Ezra was surprised to hear the biblical reference from someone so young. "More than that." Crane replied with a nervous laugh. "Enough to fix up this place, buy some cattle, maybe even hire a hand or two. All you have to do is marry my niece and keep her out of everyone else's way." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken desperation, and the weight of impossible choices. Ezra found himself studying Isabel's face, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the stubborn set of her jaw. She wasn't asking for pity or rescue. She was negotiating the terms of her own survival. "I'll need help getting her inside," Ezra said finally. Relief flooded Crane's face, while Doc Harrigan just looked sad. Isabel's expression didn't change, but Ezra thought he saw something flicker in her eyes. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "There's a preacher in town who can perform the ceremony," Doc offered. "Judge Wilmot can make it official." "No," Isabel said firmly. "If we're going to do this, we do it properly. I won't have people saying I was married like some shameful secret." Ezra nodded, understanding her need for dignity even in these circumstances. "Tomorrow morning, then, in town with witnesses." As they began the awkward process of transferring Isabel from Crane's wagon to Ezra's cabin, she leaned close enough to whisper in his ear. "I can shoot," she said quietly, "and I'm not afraid to." It wasn't a threat, it was information. A glimpse into the steel spine that had kept her alive through 6 months of pain and humiliation. Ezra found himself almost smiling for the first time in weeks. "Good," he whispered back. "Out here that might matter more than walking." The marriage ceremony took place the following morning in Judge Wilmot's stuffy office, with half the town in attendance, not out of goodwill, but from morbid curiosity. Buck Morrison stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed, watching the proceedings with the satisfied air of a man who'd successfully rid himself of a problem. Isabel had somehow managed to procure a simple white dress for the occasion, and someone, probably Doc Harrigan's wife, had helped her arrange her hair in a more flattering style. She looked beautiful and dignified, despite the circumstances, every inch the lady she'd been raised to be. Ezra, for his part, had shaved and put on his best shirt, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was attending a funeral rather than a wedding. His own funeral, perhaps, or the death of whatever dreams he'd once harbored for a normal life. "Do you, Ezra Kane, take Isabel Crane to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer? Till death do you part?" Ezra's mouth was dry as dust, but his voice was steady. "I do." "Manakel. And do you, Isabel Crane, take Ezra Kane to be your lawfully wedded husband to have, and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, till death do you part?" Isabel's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the silent room. "I do. By the power vested in me by the territory of Nebraska, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The awkward moment stretched between them before Ezra leaned down and pressed his lips briefly to Isabel's forehead, a gesture of respect rather than passion. She squeezed his hand in silent gratitude. Buck Morrison stepped forward with the promised envelope. "Congratulations, Kane. Don't say I never did anything for you." Ezra took the money without looking at it, his jaw clenched tight. "Are we square now, Buck? As far as I'm concerned, you're exactly where you belong." Buck replied, his smile cold as winter. "Both of you." After the other witnesses had dispersed, Ezra and Isabel sat in uncomfortable silence in Doc Harrigan's parlor. The weight of what they just committed to pressed down on them like a physical thing. "We should discuss arrangements," Isabel said finally, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I don't expect, that is, I understand this is a business arrangement." "I'll sleep in the barn," Ezra said quickly. "Or build a lean-to, whatever makes you comfortable." "Thank you." Her voice was barely audible. "I know this isn't what you wanted." "Is it what you wanted?" Isabel was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "What I wanted was to walk again. What I wanted was for my family to see me as something other than a burden. What I wanted was to matter to someone." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "This isn't what I wanted, but it's what I've got. And I intend to make the best of it." The simple dignity of her words hit Ezra like a physical blow. Here was someone who'd lost everything that mattered to her, yet still found the strength to look forward rather than back. He thought of his own wallowing in self-pity and felt a flash of shame. "We'll figure it out," he said. Together. The ride back to the cabin was conducted in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the enormity of what they'd just undertaken. When they arrived, Ezra felt a fresh wave of shame wash over him as he saw the place through Isabel's eyes, the sagging porch, the broken shutters, the weeds growing up through the floorboards. Getting Isabel into the house proved to be the first of many challenges. The doorway was too narrow for her wheelchair, forcing Ezra to carry her while she directed him on maneuvering the chair. The unwanted intimacy of holding her in his arms left them both flustered and embarrassed. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kane," Ezra said once they were inside, trying to inject some lightness into the moment. Isabel looked around the dim, cluttered interior, at the rough-hewn furniture, the cobwebs in the corners, the stack of dirty dishes in the basin, and managed a weak smile. "It has potential," she said diplomatically. That first night, Ezra made good on his promise and slept in the barn while Isabel took the bedroom. He lay awake on a pile of straw, listening to the sounds she made as she struggled to get comfortable in an unfamiliar bed, and wondered what the hell he'd gotten them both into. Neither of them slept well. The first week of their marriage was a masterclass in frustration and stubborn pride. Isabel, determined to prove her worth despite her limitations, insisted on attempting household tasks that had become monumentally difficult. Ezra watched her struggle to reach the stove from her wheelchair, saw the way she gritted her teeth as she tried to sweep the floor with a broom that was too long and unwieldy. "Let me help," he offered repeatedly, only to be met with a sharp shake of her head. "I can manage." But she couldn't, and they both knew it. The simple act of preparing a meal became an ordeal that left Isabel exhausted and near tears, though she'd die before admitting defeat. Ezra, for his part, felt like he was walking on eggshells, never knowing when his offers of assistance would be welcomed or rebuffed. Their first real argument came on the third day when Isabel tried to do the washing in the old tub behind the cabin. Ezra was chopping wood nearby, keeping one eye on her in case she needed help when he heard the splash and her sharp cry of alarm. He dropped his axe and ran, finding Isabel half submerged in the wash tub, her dress soaked through her face, flushed with humiliation and rage. Without thinking, he reached for her, only to have her slap his hands away. "Don't," she snapped, her voice thick with tears. "Don't touch me." "Isabel, you're hurt." "I'm not hurt, I'm angry." She was crying now, furious tears that she tried to hide by turning her face away. "I'm angry that I can't do something as simple as washing clothes without falling into the damn tub like a child." Ezra knelt beside the tub, careful not to reach for her again. "Then let's figure out a way to make it work." "There is no way to make it work." Isabel's voice cracked. "Don't you understand? I'm useless. I can't cook. I can't clean. I can't even dress myself properly half the time. What kind of wife am I supposed to be?" The pain in her voice cut through him like a blade. He thought of his own recent struggles with feeling worthless and discarded the crushing weight of believing he had nothing to offer anyone. "You're the only wife I've got," he said quietly. "And I'm the only husband you've got. Maybe we can figure out how to be useless together." Despite her tears, Isabel almost smiled at that. "Is that supposed to be comforting?" "It's supposed to be honest." Ezra stood and began rolling up his sleeves. "Now let's get you out of there before you catch pneumonia." This time she didn't resist when he lifted her from the tub, though she remained stiff in his arms. He carried her into the house and set her gently on the bed, then brought her a towel and some dry clothes. "I'll be outside while you change," he said, giving her privacy. When she called him back in, she was dressed in a simple gray dress, her hair damp but neatly braided. She looked young and vulnerable, nothing like the fierce woman who'd been trying to conquer the washtub. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I know this isn't easy for you either. Maybe that's why we're a good match," Ezra replied, settling into the chair across from her. We're both trying to figure out how to live with what we've lost. That afternoon, Ezra began making changes to the cabin. He lowered the kitchen shelves so Isabel could reach them from her wheelchair, widened the doorways, and sanded down the rough floorboards that caught on her wheels. The work was slow and exhausting. He'd never been much of a carpenter. But Isabel watched him with something that might have been gratitude. "You don't have to do all this," she said one evening as he struggled to install a pulley system that would let her reach the high cabinets. "Yes, I do." He paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow. "This is your home now. It should work for you." "Our home," Isabel corrected gently. Something shifted between them in that moment, a subtle change in the atmosphere that neither of them acknowledged aloud. They were still strangers, still bound together by circumstances beyond their control, but they were beginning to understand each other. Over the following days, they developed a routine that played to their respective strengths. Ezra handled the heavy outdoor work, what little of it there was on their failing ranch, while Isabel took charge of the household management and their meager finances. She had a head for numbers, a skill learned from helping her father run his general store before her accident, and she quickly identified ways to stretch their resources. "We need chickens," she announced one morning over breakfast. "And a milk cow if we can afford it. The eggs and milk will save us money, and anything extra we can sell in town." Ezra nodded, impressed by her practical thinking. "What about feed?" "We've got enough pasture for grazing, and I can grow vegetables to supplement. There's good soil behind the house. It just needs clearing and tilling." "That's a lot of work." Isabel's smile was sharp. "Good thing we're both accustomed to hard work." Their first trip to town together was an ordeal that tested both their resolve. Isabel insisted on coming along when Ezra went to buy supplies, refusing to be left behind like an invalid. The stares and whispers that followed them through the general store were merciless, and Ezra found his temper rising with each pointed look and whispered comment. "Let them stare," Isabel said quietly as they waited for their purchases to be tallied. "They're not looking at us, they're looking at their own fears." "What do you mean?" "They see a man who's lost his reputation and a woman who's lost her legs, and they're terrified that the same thing could happen to them. We're living proof that life can take everything you think you're entitled to." Her insight surprised him. He'd been so focused on his own shame and anger that he'd never considered how their situation might affect others. The idea that they might inspire fear rather than just pity was oddly comforting. "Does that make it easier?" he asked. "Not easier," Isabel replied, "but it makes sense." Their fragile peace was shattered on a gray November morning when riders appeared on the horizon. Isabel spotted them first from her position at the kitchen window, where she'd been planning their winter provisions. "Ezra." She called, her voice tight with tension. "Company coming." Ezra stepped onto the porch, his hand instinctively checking his sidearm. 4 men approached at an easy lope. Buck Morrison flanked by Pete Garner, Slim Atwood, and a 4th man Ezra didn't recognize. They rode with the casual confidence of men who expected no resistance. "Morning, Kane," Buck called out as they reined in. "Thought we'd ride out and see how the newlyweds were settling in." "We're doing fine," Ezra replied, his voice carefully neutral. "What brings you all the way out here?" Buck dismounted, his men following suit. The stranger was a lean man, with cold eyes and a scar across his left cheek that spoke of violence as a profession rather than an accident. "Well, that's the thing." Buck continued, his tone conversational. "We've been talking in town, and some folks are starting to wonder if maybe we were too hasty in our generosity." Ezra felt his stomach clench. Meaning that money we provided was meant to help you contribute to the community again. But from what I can see, you're still sitting out here in the middle of nowhere, not doing much of anything. "We're building our lives," Isabel said from the doorway, her wheelchair positioned so she could see the confrontation. That was the arrangement. Buck tipped his hat mockingly. "Ma'am, Pleased to see you're adjusting to married life. His smile was cruel. Though I have to wonder what my brother would think of how Kane here has been, caring for you. The implication sent a flash of rage through Ezra. You son of a bitch. Easy now. Buck raised his hands in mock surrender. Just making conversation. But the fact remains, we invested in your fresh start, and we're not seeing much return on that investment. The scarred stranger spat tobacco juice into the dirt. What we're seeing is a coward and a cripple playing house, while decent folks do the real work. The words hung in the air like gunshots. Ezra felt the familiar surge of shame and anger. But beneath it, something new stirred a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. I think you've said enough, he said quietly. Buck laughed. Have I? Because the way I see it, we've got a right to check on our investment. Make sure you're treating your wife with the respect she deserves. He took a step closer to the porch. Matter of fact, maybe we should come inside, have a proper visit. No. The word came out harder than Ezra intended. You're not welcome in my house. The atmosphere changed instantly. Buck's genial mask slipped, revealing the cold hatred beneath. Your house seems to me, this place belongs to whoever's strong enough to hold it. Slim Atwood had been circling around toward the side of the cabin, and now Ezra realized their true purpose. This wasn't a social call, it was a test. They wanted to see if he'd fight or run when faced with real danger. Isabel, Ezra said without taking his eyes off Buck. Go inside, lock the door. I'm not leaving you, she replied, or he could hear the click of metal on metal as she cocked her father's old Colt. Buck heard it too, and his expression darkened. Now that's not very hospitable, ma'am. We just came to talk. Then talk, Isabel said, her voice steady despite the danger. From where you are. For a long moment, the five of them stood frozen, Ezra on the porch. Isabel in the doorway behind him, Buck and his men spread out in the yard like wolves preparing to attack. The wind picked up, stirring dust devils and rattling the bare branches of the cottonwoods. Then Buck smiled and remounted his horse. This has been real educational, Kane. We'll be back to continue our conversation real soon. As they rode away, Ezra felt his knees go weak with relief. But he also felt something else, a cold certainty that this was far from over. That night, Ezra and Isabel barely spoke as they went through their evening routine. The confrontation had shaken them both, stripping away the illusion of safety they'd begun to build around their isolated life. What did Buck mean about his brother? Isabel asked as she prepared for bed. About what Tommy would think. Ezra was silent for a long moment, staring into the dying fire. He'd been dreading this question, but he owed her the truth. Tommy Morrison was my best friend, he said finally. We grew up together, worked together, planned to expand our ranches side by side. When the Apache hit our patrol in Devil's Canyon, He swallowed hard. I failed him, got him killed. Isabel wheeled closer, her face serious in the flickering light. What really happened out there? The question he'd been avoiding, the one that cut straight to the heart of his shame. Tommy took an arrow in the chest. He was calling for help, and I froze. By the time I could move, it was too late. The other men saw me hesitate, saw me fail when it mattered most. Were you afraid? Terrified, Ezra admitted. I'd never been in a real fight before, never had someone depending on me like that. When I saw all that blood, heard Tommy screaming, he shook his head. I'm not the man people thought I was. Isabel was quiet for a long time, her fingers absently stroking the arm of her wheelchair. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. You know what I think? I think you're exactly the man people thought you were. You just discovered that being brave isn't about not being afraid. It's about what you do when you are afraid. Tommy still died because of my cowardice. Tommy died because war is brutal and unpredictable. You said he was calling for help. That means he was still alive when you had the chance to act. The fact that you hesitated doesn't make you a coward. It makes you human. She turned her wheelchair toward the bedroom, then paused. And Ezra, when those men come back, and they will come back, I know you won't freeze. Not anymore. 3 days later, a winter storm rolled in from the north, bringing howling winds and driving snow that turned the world into a white hell. Ezra spent the afternoon battening down the cabin, securing the shutters and banking the fire, while Isabel prepared their supplies for what looked to be a long siege. They were trapped inside for 2 days, the storm so fierce that Ezra couldn't even make it to the barn to check on their animals. They passed the time in quiet conversation, sharing stories of their lives before circumstances had brought them together. Ezra learned that Isabel had once been engaged to a prominent businessman in Omaha, that she'd been planning to modernize her father's store with new inventory from back east, that she'd had dreams of opening a school for young women. The accident had ended all of that, leaving her not just physically broken, but emotionally adrift. I kept thinking someone would come, she admitted on the second night as they sat before the fire. My fiancé, my friend, someone who would see past the chair to the person I still was inside. But they all disappeared one by one until only Uncle Harold was left. And he couldn't wait to get rid of me. At their loss, Ezra said and meant it. Isabel learned that Ezra had once harbored political ambitions, that he'd planned to run for territorial representative, that he'd dreamed of bringing law and order to the frontier. The incident with Tommy had destroyed those dreams. But more than that, it had shattered his confidence in his own judgment. I used to think I could read people, he said. Understand their motivations, predict their actions. But I never saw Buck's hatred coming. Never realized how much he blamed me for his brother's death. Maybe that's because you were looking for the good in people, Isabel suggested. That's not a character flaw, Ezra. It's what makes you human. On the third morning, the storm finally broke, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. Ezra was outside clearing drifts from the door when he heard the sound of horses approaching through the white silence. This time, there were 6 riders. Buck Morrison led the group, his breath steaming in the frigid air. Beside him rode the scarred stranger from their previous visit, along with Pete Garner's Slim Atwood and 2 other men Ezra didn't recognize. They all wore heavy coats against the cold, and their horses pranced nervously in the snow. "A hell of a storm," Buck called out conversationally. "Hope you folks stayed warm." Ezra said nothing, his hand resting on his gun butt. Behind him, he could hear Isabel positioning her wheelchair near the window with the old Colt in her lap. "See, Kane, we've been thinking about our last conversation." Buck continued, "And we've decided you might need some additional motivation to contribute to the community." "What kind of motivation?" Ezra asked, though he already suspected the answer. The scarred man leaned forward in his saddle. "The kind that comes at the business end of a gun. You owe these gentlemen a considerable debt, and debts need to be paid." Ezra felt his world tilt sideways. "What debt? You gave me that money as a dowry." "Did I?" Buck's smile was triumphant. "I don't recall saying anything about a gift. Do you boys?" The men behind him shook their heads in unison, obviously coached. Ezra realized with growing horror that he'd walked into a trap that had been months in the making. "You're lying," he said. "Prove it," Buck replied. "Show me some paper that says it was a gift. Bring me witnesses who'll swear to it." The trap was perfect and merciless. Buck had maneuvered them into exactly the position he wanted, isolated, dependent, and completely at his mercy. There would be no witnesses to contradict his story, no legal recourse for 2 people the community had already written off. "What do you want?" Ezra asked. "Well, first, we'll need to assess your assets," Buck said, dismounting along with his men. "See what you've got that might be worth something." The men began moving toward the cabin, and Ezra stepped into their path. "Stay away from my house, or what?" The scarred man's hand hovered near his gun. "You'll stop us For a moment, Ezra felt the familiar paralysis creeping over him, the same helpless fear that had frozen him in Devil's Canyon. These were hardened killer's men, who wouldn't hesitate to put a bullet in him if he resisted. The smart thing, the safe thing would be to step aside and let them take whatever they wanted. Then he heard Isabel's voice from the doorway, clear and strong despite the danger. "He won't have to stop you alone." The click of her Colt being cocked echoed across the snow-covered yard. But instead of fear, Ezra felt something snap into place inside him, a clarity he hadn't experienced in months. These men were threatening his wife, his home, everything he'd tried to build from the ashes of his former life. "You heard her." Ezra said, his voice steady for the first time since Tommy's death. "Back away from my house." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 6 armed men against 2 people who'd found something worth defending. Buck's face was a mask of cold fury as he realized his intimidation tactics weren't working as planned. "This is touching," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The coward and the cripple standing together against the world." "We're not standing against the world," Isabel said quietly. "We're standing against you." Buck's composure cracked slightly. "You think you can take all of us. You think your husband won't run when the shooting starts. I think you'll find out if you take another step," Ezra replied. The scarred man was growing impatient. "Boss, we're wasting time. Let me put a bullet in him and be done with it." "Not yet." Buck said, his eyes never leaving Ezra's face. "I want him to know what's coming. I want him to think about it, to be afraid to remember what happened to Tommy when he counted on Ezra Kane to have his back." "Tommy's dead," Ezra said flatly. "And using his memory to justify this won't bring him back." "No, but it'll make me feel better," Buck replied. "You see, Kane, I've been planning this for months. Ever since I realized that a simple beating wasn't enough to satisfy my need for justice. You took my brother from me, and now I'm going to take everything from you." The hatred in his voice was palpable, a living thing that seemed to poison the air around them. "You want to know the truth about that day in Devil's Canyon?" Buck continued, his voice rising with barely contained rage. "You want to know why Tommy was so eager to volunteer for that patrol?" Ezra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "What are you talking about?" "He was running from me." Buck spat. "Running from the questions I'd been asking about missing cattle, about money that didn't add up in the ranch books. My little brother was stealing from me, Kane. And when I started getting close to the truth, he volunteered for the most dangerous patrol he could find." The revelation hit Ezra like a physical blow. All this time, he'd tormented himself with guilt over Tommy's death, never knowing that his friend had been carrying secrets that might have gotten him killed anyway. "You're lying," Ezra said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I then explain why he left a signed confession in his saddlebags? Explain why he begged me in his last letter not to pursue the missing money?" Buck's smile was ugly with triumph. "My brother died a thief, Kane. And the only thing that's kept me from telling the whole town is my need to see you suffer first." Isabel's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "If that's true, then why blame Ezra? Why not accept that your brother made his own choices?" Buck's attention snapped to her, his face twisting with rage. "Because someone had to pay. Someone had to be held accountable. So you chose the one person who couldn't defend himself," Isabel said. "The one person who was too consumed with guilt to fight back." "Enough." Buck snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. "I've had enough of both of you." The scarred man was faster, his weapon clearing leather with practiced ease. But he hadn't counted on Isabel's determination or her skill with her father's old Colt. Her shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying into the snow. The yard erupted into chaos. Ezra dove behind the porch railing as bullets began flying, Isabel rolling her wheelchair back into the cabin for cover. Buck's remaining men spread out trying to flank the house while keeping up a steady barrage. "I give it up, Kane," Buck shouted over the gunfire. "You're outnumbered and outgunned." Ezra's mind raced as he tried to assess their options. The cabin's windows were too small to provide good firing positions, and they were running low on ammunition. Worse, one of Buck's men had circled around behind the house, cutting off their escape route to the barn. "Ezra," Isabel called from inside the cabin. "The root cellar." He remembered the old storm cellar behind the kitchen accessed through a trap door in the floor. If they could reach it, they might be able to wait out the attack or find another way to turn the tables. "Can you make it?" he called back. "I'll have to." The next few minutes were a nightmare of flying bullets and desperate maneuvering. Ezra provided covering fire, while Isabel dragged herself from her wheelchair to the trap door, her legs useless, but her arms strong from months of compensation. Together, they managed to get into the cellar just as Buck's men stormed the cabin. The root cellar was cramped and dark, smelling of earth and stored vegetables. Isabel pressed against Ezra's side, both of them breathing hard from exertion and fear. "They'll find us," she whispered. "Maybe," Ezra replied, "but not if we find them first." The cellar had a second entrance, an old tunnel that led to the barn, a relic from the days when Indian raids were common and quick escapes were sometimes necessary. Ezra had forgotten about it until now, the entrance hidden behind sacks of potatoes. They made their way through the tunnel by feel, Isabel crawling beside him through the darkness. It was slow going, and they could hear Buck's men above them, searching the cabin and growing increasingly frustrated. The tunnel emerged in the barn's tack room behind a false wall that Ezra's predecessor had installed. They found themselves among the horses, who nickered nervously at the sound of gunfire from the house. "Now what?" Isabel asked. Ezra was already moving, checking the loads in his rifle and pistol. "Now we even the odds." Buck's men had made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed their quarry was trapped in the cabin and had focused all their attention on that single location. They never expected an attack from behind. Ezra left Isabel in the barn with instructions to create a distraction if things went badly, then circled around to approach the cabin from the blind side. Through the window, he could see Pete Garner ransacking their meager possessions while Slim Atwood kept watch at the front door. The first shot took Garner completely by surprise, dropping him where he stood. Atwood spun toward the sound, giving Ezra time to shift position and fire again. The second shot went wide, but it sent Atwood diving for cover behind an overturned table. "Boss," Atwood shouted, "they're not in here, it's a trap." But Buck was already moving his remaining men, converging on the barn where they'd heard the horses. Ezra realized with growing horror that he'd led them straight to Isabel. He ran across the open ground between the cabin and barn, no longer caring about cover or tactics. All that mattered was reaching Isabel before Buck did. He arrived to find Buck Morrison standing over Isabel's wheelchair, his gun pointed at her head. The scarred man was there too, his wounded arm in a makeshift sling, but his weapon steady in his good hand. "Drop your gun, Kane," Buck said calmly, "or I put a bullet in your wife's pretty head." Ezra felt the familiar paralysis creeping over him, the same fear that had frozen him in Devil's Canyon. History was repeating itself, another person he cared about in mortal danger, another chance to fail when it mattered most. But then Isabel spoke, her voice steady despite the gun at her temple. "He's not the same man who froze in that canyon, Buck. And I'm not going to die quietly like your brother did." Her words cut through his fear like a knife. She was right, he wasn't the same man. The months of living with Isabel, of building something together from nothing, had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. "You're right," Ezra said, his voice growing stronger. "I'm not the same man. That man would have thrown down his gun and begged for mercy. But this man," he raised his rifle not at Buck, but at the oil lamp hanging from the barn's center beam. "This man knows that sometimes you have to risk everything to save what matters most." The shot shattered the lamp, sending burning oil cascading down onto the hay-strewn floor. The barn erupted into flames with shocking speed, the dry wood and fodder providing perfect fuel for the blaze. In the chaos that followed, Isabel rolled her chair backward into the scarred man's legs, sending him stumbling into the flames. Buck's shot went wide as he tried to avoid the spreading fire, giving Ezra the opening he needed. The two men crashed together in a tangle of limbs and fury, rolling dangerously close to the flames. Buck was younger and stronger, but Ezra fought with the desperation of a man who'd found something worth dying for. They traded blows that would have felled lesser men, each trying to gain the advantage while the barn burned around them. It was Isabel who ended it, her father's Colt speaking one final time. Buck Morrison crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with surprise and pain, his gun spinning away across the burning floor. "That's for threatening my husband," she said quietly. They barely made it out of the barn before the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. Ezra carried Isabel to safety, while the surviving members of Buck's gang fled into the night, their leader dead and their cause lost. As they watched the barn burn, Isabel leaned against Ezra's shoulder, both of them exhausted and shaken by what they'd survived. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over." Ezra confirmed, though he knew the consequences of this night would ripple through their lives for years to come. The weeks following the shootout brought a parade of visitors to the Kane ranch. First came the territorial marshal investigating the deaths and taking statements from witnesses. Then came the curious townsfolk drawn by morbid fascination with the couple who'd stood up to Buck Morrison's gang. Most surprising of all was the delegation from the territorial capital, led by Governor Samuel Crawford himself. They arrived on a crisp December morning, their official carriage cutting an incongruous figure against the backdrop of the still-blackened barn ruins. "Mr. and Mrs. Kane," the governor said, as he dismounted, his voice carrying the authority of high office. "I've come to discuss a matter of considerable importance to the territory." They gathered in the cabin's main room, Isabel serving coffee, while Ezra tried to hide his nervousness. What could the territorial government want with two outcasts who'd just survived a gun battle? "I'll get straight to the point," Governor Crawford said, accepting a cup from Isabel with a nod of thanks. The incident with Buck Morrison and his associates has shed light on a pattern of corruption and violence that extends far beyond your personal conflict. Ezra felt his stomach clench. "What kind of pattern?" Cattle rustling protection rackets, intimidation of homesteaders, Morrison was running a criminal empire that we're only beginning to understand. Your actions in stopping him have done the territory a considerable service. Isabel leaned forward in her wheelchair. "What does that mean for us?" The governor smiled. "It means you're heroes, Mrs. Kane. The story of your courage has spread throughout the territory, inspiring others to stand up to similar threats. More importantly, your victory has broken the back of Morrison's organization." He reached into his coat and withdrew an official-looking document. "The territorial legislature has voted to award you a substantial reward for your service to law and order. Enough to rebuild your ranch and establish yourselves as productive members of the community." Ezra stared at the document, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. After months of being treated as outcasts, they were suddenly being hailed as heroes. "There's more," the governor continued. "We'd like to offer you an official position, Mr. Kane. The territory needs men of proven courage and integrity to serve as federal marshals in the more lawless regions." The offer was generous, almost too generous. Ezra could picture the life it would provide: respect authority, a chance to make a real difference in bringing law to the frontier. But when he looked at Isabel, he saw his own reservations reflected in her face. "It's a tempting offer, Governor," Ezra said carefully. "But I'm not sure I'm the right man for the job." "Why not? You've proven you can stand up to criminals, protect the innocent, uphold justice, even when it costs you personally." "I've proven I can defend my home and my wife," Ezra corrected. "That's not the same thing as being a lawman." Governor Crawford studied him for a long moment. "What would it take to convince you?" Ezra looked at Isabel, seeing the slight nod that told him she understood what he was thinking. They'd built something here from nothing, created a life, that was theirs by choice, rather than circumstance. The offer of respectability was tempting, but it would mean leaving behind everything they'd fought to achieve. "We appreciate the recognition, Governor," Isabel said diplomatically. "But we've found our place here. This is where we belong." After the official delegation left Ezra, and Isabel sat in comfortable silence on their porch, watching the sun set over the Nebraska plains. The ruins of the barn served as a reminder of what they'd survived, but also of what they'd accomplished. "Do you regret it?" Isabel asked. Turning down the marshal's position, Ezra considered the question as he always did when Isabel asked about their choices. "No," he said finally. "I've had enough of other people's expectations. I'd rather build something that's ours, even if it means staying outcasts. We're not outcasts anymore." Ezra replied, gesturing toward the trail where dust clouds marked the approach of more visitors. "Word's gotten out about what happened here. People are curious about the couple who stood up to Buck Morrison. Indeed, the following months brought a steady stream of visitors, some seeking help with their own problems, others simply wanting to hear the story firsthand. Ezra found himself reluctantly cast in the role of local hero, while Isabel became known throughout the territory for her courage and determination. But fame, they discovered, was a double-edged sword. With recognition came responsibility, and with responsibility came pressure to live up to other people's expectations of what heroes should be. The breaking point came in early spring when a delegation of homesteaders arrived seeking Ezra's help with a group of cattle barons who were trying to drive them off their land. Their leader, a weathered German immigrant named Klaus Brenner, laid out their situation with desperate eloquence. "They say we have no right to the land, that it belongs to the cattle," Brenner explained. "They burn our crops, poison our wells, threaten our families. The law does nothing because the cattle barons own the judges." Ezra felt the familiar weight of other people's expectations settling on his shoulders. These people had traveled hundreds of miles, seeking his help, believing that the man who defeated Buck Morrison could solve their problems too. "I'm not a gunfighter," he said carefully. "What happened with Morrison was personal. This is different. But you understand what it means to be pushed aside, to be told you don't matter." Brenner replied, "You and your wife, you know what it is to fight for your place in the world." The words hit home as they were meant to. Ezra looked at Isabel, seeing the conflict in her eyes. They both understood the homesteaders' plight, both felt the pull of obligation to help those who couldn't help themselves. But they also understood the cost of such help. Taking on the cattle barons would mean leaving their hard-won peace behind, stepping back into a world of violence and conflict that they'd barely survived once. "We need time to think," Isabel said finally. "This isn't a decision we can make lightly." After the homesteaders left, Ezra and Isabel talked long into the night about their responsibilities to others and to themselves. The conversation was difficult, touching on questions of duty and conscience that had no easy answers. "They're right about one thing," Isabel said as they prepared for bed. "We do understand what it means to be pushed aside, and we know what it took to push back. But at what cost?" Ezra replied. "We've found something here, Isabel. Something rare and precious. Are we willing to risk it for people we barely know?" "Maybe the question isn't whether we're willing to risk it," Isabel said thoughtfully. "Maybe the question is whether we can live with ourselves if we don't." The next morning brought their answer in the form of a letter from Klaus Brenner. The cattle barons had escalated their campaign of intimidation, burning out 3 homestead families in a single night. One family, a young couple with 2 small children, had barely escaped with their lives. "We have to help them," Isabel said after reading the letter aloud. Ezra nodded, though his heart was heavy with the knowledge of what they were committing to. "I know. But we do it our way on our terms." Their way, as it turned out, involved more strategy than gunplay. Instead of riding into the conflict as lone heroes, They organized the homesteaders into a coherent force, teaching them to defend themselves and work together against their oppressors. Ezra used his knowledge of frontier warfare to establish defensive positions and communication networks, while Isabel applied her business acumen to economic warfare, organizing boycotts of cattle-baron businesses and seeking legal remedies through territorial courts. The campaign was long and difficult, stretching through the summer and into the fall. There were victories and defeats, moments of triumph and periods of despair. But gradually, the tide began to turn in the homesteaders' favor. The decisive moment came when the cattle barons overplayed their hand, launching a massive raid against the largest homestead settlement. But instead of finding scattered, frightened farmers, they encountered a well-organized defense that had been preparing for months. The battle was fierce, but brief. When the smoke cleared, the cattle barons' hired guns were either dead wounded or in full retreat. More importantly, their leaders had been captured and would face justice in territorial courts. "It's over," Klaus Brenner said as they watched the last of the defeated raiders disappear over the horizon. "We owe you everything, Mr. and Mrs. Kane." But Ezra was already shaking his head. "You don't owe us anything. You fought for yourselves with your own courage and determination. We just helped you organize it." The homesteaders' victory resonated throughout the territory, inspiring other communities to stand up to similar threats. But Ezra and Isabel were careful to avoid being drawn into every conflict that arose. They'd learned the difference between helping people help themselves and taking on the world's problems as their own responsibility. 2 years after their confrontation with Buck Morrison, Ezra Kane stood in the doorway of his rebuilt barn, watching his wife work with their horses in the corral outside. The specialized riding harness he'd designed had been refined and improved, allowing Isabel to ride with confidence and grace despite her paralyzed legs. The sight still took his breath away. Isabel mounted on their gentle mare, her face radiant with joy, as she guided the horse through a series of simple maneuvers. She'd become an accomplished rider, compensating for her lack of leg control with subtle shifts in balance and expert use of the reins. "You're staring again," Isabel called out, noticing his attention. "We can't help it," Ezra replied, stepping into the sunlight. "Still amazes me every time I see you up there." Isabel guided the mare over to the fence, where Ezra stood, her eyes bright with contentment. "Want to join me? The sunset's going to be spectacular tonight." Ezra was already moving toward his own horse, a sturdy gelding that had been trained to work alongside Isabel's mare. They'd developed a routine of evening rides, exploring their expanding ranch and enjoying the peace they'd fought so hard to achieve. As they rode out across the prairie, Isabel reached over and took Ezra's hand, a gesture that had become natural over the months of their growing partnership. Below them, the lights of their ranch house glowed warm and welcoming in the gathering dusk. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd made different choices?" Isabel asked as they paused on their favorite hilltop overlooking the valley. Ezra considered the question as he always did when Isabel posed her thoughtful inquiries. "Sometimes. But then I remember that all our choices, good and bad, led us here. And I can't imagine being anywhere else. Even with all the pain we went through. All the mistakes and struggles. Especially because of them," Ezra replied. "They taught us who we really are, what we're capable of when we stop letting fear make our decisions." Isabel nodded, her hand tightening on his. "The world tried to throw us away, didn't it? Tried to convince us we were broken, useless, better off forgotten. But we proved them wrong. We proved that strength comes from how you respond to weakness, not from never being weak in the first place." As they sat together, watching the stars emerge in the vast western sky, both of them understood that their story was far from over. There would be new challenges, fresh obstacles, unexpected joys and sorrows yet to come. But they would face them together, secure in the knowledge that they'd been tested in fire and emerged stronger. The townspeople who had once mocked them as the coward and the cripple now spoke of them with respect and admiration. Children in Clearwater grew up hearing stories of the couple who'd stood up to Buck Morrison's gang, who'd helped the homesteaders fight off the cattle barons, who'd proved that courage wasn't about being fearless, but about acting despite fear. But more than their public reputation, Ezra and Isabel treasured the private life they'd built together. They'd learned to love, not in spite of their scars, but because of them understanding that true intimacy came from seeing and accepting each other's vulnerabilities. "I have something for you," Ezra said as they prepared to head home. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small wooden box carefully carved with intricate designs. Isabel opened it to find a simple gold locket engraved with their initials and the date of their wedding. Inside was a tiny photograph, the first they'd ever had taken together, captured by a traveling photographer who'd passed through town the previous month. "It's beautiful," Isabel whispered, her eyes bright with tears. "But what's the occasion?" "No occasion," Ezra replied, helping her fasten the chain around her neck. "Just wanted you to have something that showed how I see you, not as the woman you were before the accident, not as the person others expected you to be, but as the Isabel I fell in love with, the one who's sitting here beside me right now." They rode home through the moonlight, their horses' hooves keeping rhythm with their shared contentment. Behind them, the lights of Clearwater twinkled in the distance, a community that had learned to see past surface judgments to the character underneath. Ahead lay their ranch, their future, and whatever challenges and joys tomorrow might bring. In the end, Ezra Kane and Isabel Crane had accomplished something remarkable. They'd taken the cruel circumstances that had brought them together and transformed them into something beautiful. They'd proved that love wasn't about perfection, but about choosing to build something lasting from whatever broken pieces remained. Their story became legend in the territory, not as a fairy tale of miraculous healing, but as a testament to the power of human resilience and the transformative nature of genuine partnership. They'd shown that strength could emerge from weakness, that love could grow from desperation, and that two people who'd been discarded by the world could create something that world would remember long after they were gone. The broken cowboy and the paralyzed woman had indeed changed their cruel town forever. But more importantly, they'd changed each other, discovering in the process that sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in the harshest soil, watered by tears and strengthened by storms they never could have weathered alone. As they settled in for another night in the home they'd built from nothing, Isabel turned to Ezra with a smile that had become his anchor in every storm. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what? For seeing me, for choosing me, for proving that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose imperfections fit perfectly with your own." Ezra pulled her close, marveling once again at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I love you, Isabel Kane. Exactly as you are, exactly where you are, exactly who you've become. And I love you, Ezra Kane. My husband, my partner, my proof that second chances can be better than first ones if you're brave enough to take them." Outside their window, the Nebraska wind whispered across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the possibilities it might hold. Inside their home, two people who'd found each other in the darkest hour rested in the peace they'd earned through fire and blood, courage and compassion, and the simple but revolutionary act of refusing to let the world define their worth. Their story was complete, their love secure, their future bright with promise. The broken cowboy had learned to stand tall again, the paralyzed woman had discovered new ways to soar, and together they'd proved that sometimes the ending you don't expect is exactly the beginning you need.